This is a continuation of my main channel video where I showed the pixel art techniques used to recreate Pokemon cards for the TCG game and how they actually work on real Game Boys. If you haven't watched it, click the first link in the description and then come back so you aren't confused. Now, first of all, I am not an artist. I started learning this stuff with no training or drawing skills, but learning to recreate a pre-existing picture with a very limited resolution and color palette is doable for me. And I learned the most just from studying the art I was trying to imitate. The best way to do this is by positioning the pixel art over the original art and flipping between them to compare how different elements in the scene were translated. I've uploaded a folder of 12 comparisons I've used a lot so far, check the description for that. Another thing I do when I can't decide how to interpret parts of a scene is look through the original pixel art for a similar part, like rocks or water or grass, and use that as a reference. If you want to make your own comparisons, start with the pixel art and resize it. I do 600%, then add a new layer under it and make the pixel art layer half transparent. Paste the original art on the bottom layer without resizing the frame and adjust its size until it lines up. You wouldn't want to resize the pixel art or else you'd get uneven or blurry pixels. Now let's make a card. This is just what I ended up doing this time. It's a different process for each card, so view this as a basic outline of the process and not a step-by-step tutorial. I used two applications for this, Paint.net and Aseprite, but you can probably use other software to do the same things. Starting in Paint, I put a 4:3 aspect ratio on the selection tool and figured out how I wanted to crop the original picture. Remember that there's going to be a black border around the card, so you'll want to leave some room around the edges. This card is pretty symmetrical, so I just centered on Togepi's face, then cropped, Ctrl-Shift-X in Paint, and saved. Now in Aseprite, I created a new file. The pixel art resolution is 64:48, which is 4:3. I imported the cropped art as a reference like this, then made a layer with the 1 pixel border that will stay on top from now on. Next, a layer called Outline. Be sure to pick a color that shows up on top of the image. I'll start to trace the pixels around the Pokemon's outlines from front to back, erasing and redoing parts with messy line intersections. You want to avoid lines touching at more than one corner, but sometimes it's necessary. I'll sometimes look at other sprites of the Pokemon to get ideas on how to draw something, but they're made in a different style, so don't copy them. Once I had the outline, which was very simple in this case, I went back to Paint to figure out a color palette. Usually I do this manually, either because it's obvious or because I need to cut out or combine colors to fit my palette restriction of 7 max. If you're curious, I'm going to be using the Yu-Gi-Oh method of displaying card graphics for my game, with a sprite layer and a background layer, except they'll only have 1 palette each, so it's around the same color count as the TCG2 cards, but with none of the restrictions. Anyway, a typical palette looks like this, a full 4-color monochrome-ish gradient, then 2 alternate middle colors that still use the same black and white, and a 7th color if needed. And these things are saturated. If they're not, take the original colors and push their saturation and value while keeping their brightness similar. You may also want to compare the hue values in your color gradients. Usually you want them moving in the same direction. Here's an example of what not to do. 6 shades of very similar oranges and browns look too high color next to cards with more restrained palettes. Also, the colors should be more saturated and hue shifted, and there's no dithering, I'll get to that later. I made this card very early on and it'll need to be redone, but that's okay, it takes practice to get the hang of. Back to Togepi, I wasn't seeing any obvious palettes, so I digitally quantized the number of colors down to 7, and it surprisingly came up with an effective palette. There's a 4-color purple gradient that works for the tree and the shell, then red and green for the leaves, and yellow for Togepi. Don't apply dithering like this though, we'll want to do that manually. Now going back to the original image, I shrunk it down to 64:48 using 2 resampling methods, bicubic and super sampling. Bicubic gives you a very sharp pixelated result, and super sampling gives you a smooth, blurry one. To get a result in the middle, I use bicubic first, then copy the image, then undo and use super sampling. Then just create a new layer and paste the first result, and you can morph between them by adjusting the top layer's opacity. I usually set it to around a third, then merge the 2 layers back. So I quantized that, increased the saturation and contrast, and pasted it into Aseprite on a color layer below my outline, and added all the colors to my palette. Then I erased everything around Togepi's outline. A color background layer helps see everything. After some recoloring and more saturation, I merged the outline layer onto the color layer and applied an outline, Shift+O, using the whitish color. I erased the bottom outline since that's actually the tree and Togepi is behind it. Now onto the background. Typically you'll want to separate backgrounds by color and/or element so you can process them individually. I started with the tree using the magic wand tool and Control-Shift to select all the shades of that purple color. I copied and pasted that into a new layer and gave it a neutral background. I sized it down using bicubic and super sampling, then copied the result into Aseprite to quantize the colors, this time using my own chosen palette. I'm using a 4-color gradient like I showed, but I'm also going to find colors in between each of those to turn into half dithering patterns. I'm using the original quantized image to see how it chose to color certain areas. After I have my palette with the in-between colors, I go to Sprite, Color Mode, More Options, which will apply it to the image. I copied that into Paint, increased saturation and contrast, and got the first 2 main colors in my color selection. Then I found the in-between color and used a 50% dither fill pattern to replace it with my 2 main colors. Here I'm just switching the color order with X to see which one captures more detail. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the middle 2 colors. I made sure the light purple was on the same pattern, which means the dark purple and white dithering will be right next to each other, if that makes sense. I think I messed this up with the last 2 colors though, it can be hard to tell. Now that I have a 4-color image with most of the dithering in place, I copied it back into Aseprite and recolored it using my original palette. Next I needed the red and green leaves, so I simply copied the cutout of the tree I just made and put it onto a new layer over the full picture. I changed the layer's blend mode to difference, which turns the duplicate parts black, so I'm just left with the leaves and Togepi, which I'll cut out. Then I used the same process in Aseprite that I used for the tree, picking the main and in-between colors, quantizing it, copying the result back into Paint, and replacing the extra colors with dithering, making sure to line up the black checkerboard pattern. But since the background this time was also black, I used a slightly off black color for the patterns, so when I erased the background, I'd still be left with the black dithering. I pasted that on top of my tree layer in Aseprite, more recoloring, and there we go, looking good. Digitally downscaling the background elements like this gives you a pretty solid foundation and saves a ton of time, but now you need to finish it by hand. It can seem overwhelming at first, but just zoom in and start somewhere. After that, you'll keep finding areas to improve until eventually you've gotten to everything. Just keep switching between the original art and your pixel art, looking at differences and trying new interpretations until it looks like it came from the real Pokemon TCG games. For this card, I made a lot of edits to the leaves outlines and black dithering to make them look more leaf-like. I also changed some details on the tree and changed Togepi's shadow. It's a good idea to copy your card and paste it somewhere until you've made a lot of changes, then paste it back and compare the two and see what changes you're liking or not liking. Also, flip the card horizontally and check if anything looks weird. I didn't use any quarter dithering on this card, which isn't typical, but there is really no room for it with the leaves and the tree textures everywhere, so don't force it. I've also used custom dithering brushes before with other cards. You can make them in Aseprite if you want, like this. Draw the dither pattern at the top left, select it, and press Ctrl B to make your selection a brush. You then need to save the brush or else it will be replaced by the next pattern. Here's all the variations for half and quarter dithering, add them just like that. I'll try to answer any other questions you have. I'm not an expert or anything, but I haven't found anyone else doing this. So good luck, and I'd like to see your creations on Twitter.